The stars in Sector 12 Gamma did not move. That was the first thing Commander Dale had noticed when he arrived at Station Velian 722 years ago, fresh from the academy, still carrying the particular confidence of a young officer who believed that competence alone could shape the universe. He had stood at the viewport on his first night and watched the stars and waited for something to happen. Nothing had happened. The stars did not move. The sector did not change. The silence held as it had held for a century, as it would hold presumably until the universe itself grew tired of existing. 22 years later, Dale still stood at that same viewport on the first night of every new rotation. Not from wonder anymore, from habit. The way a soldier checks his sidearm before sleeping, not because he expects danger, but because the ritual itself has become the point. He was 44 years old, and he had spent half his life watching a stretch of empty space that the Thylorian High Assembly considered worth monitoring for reasons that the classified briefings explained in careful language, and the unclassified reality reduced to a single blunt sentence: this is where the humans used to be. Used to be. Past tense. The most permanent tense there is. The Thylorian people had a word for it, Valanthi, which translated imperfectly into the concept of a space that remembers something it no longer contains. The hollow of a hand after the held thing has been set down. The silence after music stops. Sector 12 Gamma was Valanthi in the most complete sense, 2.3 billion cubic light years of space that had once held human colonies, human ships, human voices transmitting on frequencies that Thylorian analysts had spent years learning to decode. 103 years ago, those voices had stopped. Operation Clean Slate. That was what the history books called it. The final campaign of the Extinction War. The necessary conclusion to a century of escalating human expansion that had threatened the stability of every civilization within reach. The history books used words like resolution and containment and difficult but essential with the confidence of records written by people who were certain they would never be questioned. Dale had believed those history books the way young officers believe things completely, without examination. The way you believe in the solidity of the floor beneath your feet. You don't test it every morning, you simply walk. He walked to his station on the morning that changed everything and poured a cup of the bitter dark liquid the maintenance crew brewed from recycled organic compounds and called with grim humor coffee, a word borrowed from human records because apparently the humans had loved the substance so much that even their enemies had adopted the name. Dell drank his borrowed word coffee and looked at Specialist Nira's workstation, where she was running the morning diagnostics with the focused expression of someone who genuinely enjoyed the process. Nira was 26 years old. She had been assigned to Velian 7-8 months ago, fresh from her technical certification, arriving with the brightness that all new officers brought to disciplinary postings before the posting taught them what it actually was. She still had some of that brightness. Dale had made a private effort not to extinguish it. Status, he said, all systems, nominal commander. She didn't look up. Her fingers moved across the interface with precision. Background radiation within expected parameters. No anomalous signatures detected in Sector 12 Gamma or adjacent zones. A pause. Same as yesterday. Same as yesterday, Dale agreed. He settled into his command station and began reviewing the night's automated reports. 73 pages. Nothing in any of them. He initialed each one with the weary efficiency of a man who has learned to treat paperwork as meditation, not because it clears the mind, but because it fills it completely, leaving no space for larger thoughts. He was on page 41 when Specialist Nira said, "Commander." Something in her voice made him look up immediately. Not the word itself, the register of it, the way a single syllable can carry information that words cannot contain. She was staring at her console. Her hands had stopped moving. "What is it?" "There's a contact in the sector." She said it slowly, the way people say things when they're trying to make something unreal stay unreal for one more moment. "A large object, stationary, coordinates 000. She finally looked up. "Sector center." He moved to her station. On the display, the familiar emptiness of Sector 12 Gamma had developed an interruption, a solid return signal, dense and structured, sitting at the geometric center of the sector, like something placed there by intention rather than chance. "Drift debris," Dale said. "An old station fragment. I ran debris probability." Nira's voice was careful now. "The mass signature is too consistent, too uniform." She pulled up the mass reading. The number was large enough that Dale read it twice. "And there's no displacement wave, no gravitational distortion trail, no residual jump energy." She turned to look at him. "Whatever that is, it didn't arrive here. It didn't travel. According to every sensor we have, it simply appeared. The words sat between them like something physical. Dale ran through rational explanations in order of likelihood. Sensor malfunction. Software error, interference from an undetected natural phenomenon. Cascade failure in the detection array. Full diagnostics, he said, already running. She pulled up the overlay. First pass completing now. The results came back clean. Run it again. Second pass, clean. Again. Third pass, clean. Nira looked at him. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Identify, Dale said, and something in his voice shifted without permission, a tightening that happens when the body understands something before the mind catches up. Nira fed the mass signature, structural profile, and sensor readings into the station's database. The system processed for 11 seconds, a long time for a system that normally returned results in under 2. Then the result appeared. Match confidence 91.4%. Classification Terran Federation. Deep Space Vessel Class Designation unknown. Species of origin human Terran. Species status extinct 103 years. The command center was completely silent. Nira had one hand pressed flat against her console. Dale was aware of his own breathing in a way he was not normally aware of it. Run it again, he said quietly. Fourth pass, 91.4%. Human origin. Species extinct. Commander, Nira said, it's not moving. She was right. The contact sat at sector center with absolute stillness, not the stillness of a dead object drifting which carries the physics of its last momentum. This was different. The stillness of something that had decided to be still. The stillness of waiting. Long-range visual, Dale said. The targeting array swung and locked. The image was distant and partially obscured, but it was enough. The silhouette was massive, he estimated 3,200 meters at minimum. The hull was angular in a way that Thalorian design philosophy had never produced, all hard planes and deliberate geometry dark against the darkness of space in a way that suggested the material was absorbing light rather than reflecting it. No navigation lights, no visible propulsion, no signal emissions of any kind. A ship that should not exist, built by a species that had been dead for a century. Dale picked up the communication array and kept his voice level in the way that 22 years of practice makes possible. This is Commander Dale of Station Velian 7 Priority Alpha. We have an unidentified contact in Sector 12 Gamma. Mass signature consistent with a vessel of human origin. Requesting immediate confirmation and instruction. The response came in 4 minutes, fast enough that the duty officer on the other end had clearly read the report twice before responding. Maintain surveillance. Do not approach. Do not initiate contact. Admiral Kreth's strike force is being dispatched. Estimated arrival 93 minutes. Dale acknowledged and closed the channel. He stood at the center of his command station looking at the shape on his display. Nira, he said, Sir, I want to know everything about that ship before the strike force arrives. She was already moving. Then she paused and looked at him, asking what they were both thinking. Commander, why isn't it doing anything? Dale looked at the dark shape in the center of the dark sector. I don't know, he said. That's what worries me most. Admiral Kreth had fought 63 engagements in 40 years of active service. He had commanded forces in the suppression of the Velthari Rebellion, the campaign of the Outer Reaches, and 4 border enforcement actions that the official record called peacekeeping operations, and the men who fought in them called wars. His flagship, the Celestial Dominion, carried battle records going back 4,000 years. Not this hull, but the lineage of the vessel, the name and history embedded in every refit across centuries of Thalorian service. 300 victories, 0 catastrophic defeats. He arrived at Sector 12 Gamma with 14 warships and the absolute certainty of a man who has never had cause to question the adequacy of his forces. He deployed in standard confrontation formation, 7 cruisers in a forward wedge, 4 destroyers flanking the Celestial Dominion at center, 2 cruisers holding the rear perimeter. Textbook. Efficient. The formation that had resolved 63 similar situations. The human vessel did not react. Broadcast on all frequencies, Kreth ordered, including archived human dialect bands. The broadcast went out on 47 frequencies simultaneously in 9 languages, including 3 variants of standard human English preserved from intercepted transmissions made more than a century ago. Unidentified vessel. This is Admiral Kreth of the Thalorian Assembly Strike Force. You have entered sovereign Thalorian space. Identify yourself immediately or face military action. Silence. The human vessel sat at sector center with the same perfect stillness it had maintained since Dale's station first detected it. The silence had a quality that Kreth found for the first time in 40 years of confrontations faintly unsettling, not because of what it meant, but because of its texture. The sector felt less empty than it had when they arrived. He ordered the destroyer Ardent Spear forward to conduct a close-range sensor sweep. 1,200 meters of Thylorian military engineering, enough firepower to eliminate a small colony moving into scanning range. What happened next took 4.2 seconds. A pulse of light emerged from the human vessel. Not a beam, not a projectile. A pulse expanding outward in a perfect sphere, violet-white at the core fading to blue, at the edges crossing the distance between vessels at a speed Kreth's tactical display had no category to adequately measure. It struck the Ardent Spear first, then continued outward through the formation like a wave through water, passing through shields, through hull plating, through every defensive system deployed without slowing, without diminishing, without apparent effort. 14 ships, 4.2 seconds. Everyone went dark. Emergency lighting came on aboard the Celestial Dominion 7 seconds later, battery backup independent of main power. Kreth was still at his command station. His stance locked instinctively when the power cut, and he stood in the red emergency glow, looking at a tactical display showing 14 ships with no power signatures. Drifting. Station Velion 7 was still lit on the long-range display, its systems fully operational, sitting at the sector's edge exactly as before. It had been deliberately excluded. Kreth stood in the red-lit silence of his dead bridge and understood for the first time in 40 years what it felt like to have no adequate response to a tactical situation. At Station Velion, 7 Dell and Nira had watched the entire event on their sensors. 14 ships, 4.2 seconds. Dale had his hand on the emergency alert panel and had not pressed it because the alert was intended for threats to the station, and the human vessel had demonstrated with unmistakable precision no interest in the station whatsoever. Energy analysis, Dale said. Nira's voice carried the particular steadiness that arrives after shock has passed completely through a person and out the other side. The pulse was electromagnetic in origin, but the modulation is unlike anything in our database. It targeted power systems specifically, not structure, not crew. Everything organic on those ships is unharmed. She pulled up the biosignature readings. I'm still reading full life sign returns from all 14 vessels. Not a weapon designed to kill. A tool designed to stop. How long until they restore power? Unknown. I can't identify the mechanism well enough to calculate recovery time. A pause. Commander, they could have destroyed all 14 ships in the same time frame. The energy output required for that pulse redirected as kinetic force. She stopped herself. She didn't need to finish. Whatever had just happened was a demonstration of restraint, a carefully calibrated message delivered in 4.2 seconds. We could end this. We chose not to. The communication array activated. Inbound. A signal from the human vessel directed at Station Velion 7 with a focus that communicated more clearly than any words. We know exactly where you are and what you are, and we want to speak to you, not to the fleet. Dial accepted the channel. The voice was female. It spoke in Thylorian, the working dialect, the version spoken between officers on a functional station, not the formal broadcast register Kreth had used. An accent was present, slight but identifiable as someone who had learned the language from recordings rather than native speakers. Every word was entirely unmistakably calm. Station Velion 7, this is Captain Alara Voss, commanding officer of the USS New Horizon Terran Reclamation Fleet. Dial made himself exhale before speaking. This is Commander Dial, commanding Station Velion 7. His voice held level, 22 years of practice composure holding. Your identity is not consistent with our current records. I'm aware of what your records say. Something in the voice that was quieter than amusement and older. Your records say we are dead. We are not dead, Commander. We are returned. A deliberate pause, the pause of someone who understands the weight of the moment and is giving it proper space. And we did not come here by accident or in anger. We came here because this sector does not belong to the Thylorian Assembly. This sector has been under Thylorian control. Voss said, her voice not shifting by a single register. Because you believed its original inhabitants no longer existed to contest that control. That belief was mistaken. The transmission held open for 3 more seconds after she finished, as if giving him time to sit with it before she added, "We are not here because of war, Commander Dale. We are here because of truth." The channel closed. Dale stood at his console and looked at the shape of the human vessel on his display. Then Nira said very quietly, "Commander, He looked at her. She was pointing at the sector boundary on her display. Points of light were appearing in the darkness, coming from nowhere the way the first ship had come from nowhere. 1, 3, 7, 15, 30. Not stopping. Each one resolving into the same angular silhouette, the same light-absorbing hull, the same absolute intentional stillness. 50, 80, more. And behind them visible now that the sensors were calibrated to look shapes larger than ships' orbital platforms, each one larger than anything in the Thylorian fleet manifest dark, impatient, and immovable. The count on Nira's display stopped incrementing at 847. 847 vessels arrayed at the boundary of the sector the Thylorian assembly had claimed for a century. And somewhere in the formation aboard the first ship that had shown itself, the ship that had disabled 14 warships in 4.2 seconds and then waited, a woman named Alara Voss was waiting still. Not impatiently, Dael looked at the dark shape at the center of everything. He understood now what he had been unable to articulate before, the answer to the question that had been living at the back of his mind since the moment the database returned its impossible result. Why isn't it doing anything? Because the most powerful thing in this sector had arrived without announcing itself, waited without impatience, acted without escalation, and then stopped and waited again. Because whoever was aboard that ship had learned in 100 years of darkness something that the Thylorian assembly had apparently forgotten somewhere in 4,000 years of victories. Patience is not weakness. Restraint is not retreat. The most dangerous force in any confrontation is not the side that attacks first. It is the side that could and doesn't. He reached for the communication array to report to Thylorian command. Outside the viewport, 847 ships held their positions in the Volanthi, the space that remembers what it used to contain. And the stars shone on indifferent and exact. 63 minutes passed. Dale counted them through the particular attention of a man who has nothing to do but wait, and who finds in the waiting that time becomes a physical substance with texture and temperature. He spent those 63 minutes doing what he had told Nira to do in the first minutes after contact appeared, learning everything the sensors could tell him about the vessel at the sector's center. By the time the strike force began to stir back to life, he had compiled 41 pages of data and arrived at a conclusion that fit no framework he currently possessed. The New Horizon was not only a warship, the whole configuration was military, yes. The defensive systems were beyond anything in the Thylorian arsenal by a margin that defied direct comparison. But the energy readings from the interior were wrong for a pure combat vessel. Sections of that ship were generating heat signatures consistent with habitation, not crew quarters but something larger. Long-term residential patterns. The biological readings were dense, more dense than a military roster would produce. The density of families, of children, the kind of reading that colony ships produce, not warships. Dael sat with that for a long time. Admiral Kreth's voice came across the communication array at the 64th minute, tight and controlled with the fury of a man made helpless for the first time in 4 decades. Commander Dael, report. Dael reported. He kept to the facts. He did not insert the thoughts accumulating in the back of his mind because those thoughts were not in the format of a military report. A long silence followed. Then Kreth said, "Patch the human transmission to my bridge." The channel opened. Voss's voice filled the space between them, the same voice from an hour before, carrying the same steadiness of someone who has been preparing for this conversation for a long time and has made peace with every possible version of how it might go. Admiral Kreth, I'm glad your fleet has recovered. The neutralization of your vessels was a choice made to prevent escalation, not an act of aggression. I would like the opportunity to explain our presence before any further military action is considered. Your presence, Kreth said, in 40 years of command, made his voice cold without effort, requires no explanation beyond the fact that it is impossible. The human species was eliminated 103 years ago. Whatever you represent, a remnant faction, salvage technology operated by an allied species, a political provocation, it will be treated as a threat to Thylorian sovereignty and addressed accordingly. The pause that followed was a person deciding how much patience to spend on a response they had anticipated. I understand that's your position, Voss said. I'd like to show you something before you commit to it. The signal she sent was not a conventional transmission. It was a broadband broadcast radiating outward from the New Horizon in every direction, simultaneously reaching Velian 7 at the same moment it reached the Celestial Dominion. On Dael's display, it resolved into a visual feed that he looked at for a long moment before accepting that he was reading the sensor data correctly. The ships at the sector boundary were moving inward, slowly. Not aggressively. No attack vectors, no weapon signatures, but deliberately, the way a theater audience fills the hall before a performance. 847 vessels of varying configurations, some recognizable as belonging to species, the Thylaurian assembly had absorbed across centuries, others matching no record Dale had. All moving with the coordinated patience of a force that has practiced this moment many times. Behind them, the orbital platforms became fully visible for the first time. The scale was difficult to process. The largest measured approximately the diameter of a small moon. Their energy readings were dense with a kind of continuous biological activity that a monitoring station accumulates data on over years of watching the same patterns repeat. Living structures, habitations, built by people who intended to stay for a very long time. This is the Terran Reclamation Fleet, Voss said. 847 vessels representing 31 species who have found common cause in restoring what was taken from them. The orbital platforms have been home to 2.3 billion people for the past 89 years. Those people were born there. Many have never seen a planet's surface. A beat. They have been patient. The number settled in Dayel's chest like a stone. 2.3 billion people, living in the dark. Hidden in the spaces between star systems, in the gaps the Thalorian monitoring network did not cover. Building something across 3 generations large enough to reshape the balance of everything in this region of space, and doing it in complete silence. You're lying, Kreth said. The flatness of a man who needs something to be a lie. I'm transmitting proof, Voss said. It will take you some time to review it. I'd like to give you that time. What she sent next was documents. Data packages dense with text and timestamps, and the bureaucratic specificity that is very difficult to fabricate trade, manifest diplomatic records, communication logs, the accumulated paper trail of a civilization conducting its administrative businesses across 2 centuries. The first documents were dated 203 years ago. They were unmistakably the records of a treaty. The Coexistence Accords. Dale pulled the documents onto his own display and read in parallel with whatever Kreth was seeing on his bridge. The language was formal, 2 civilizations negotiating carefully and with apparent goodwill the terms of shared existence in a contested region. Sector 12 Gamma was designated in clear and unambiguous terms as a neutral zone. Neither Thylaurian expansion nor human settlement, a buffer held in common trust. The document carried Thylaurian signatures belonging to the Assembly's founding administrative generation. He had never seen this document. He had never seen any reference to it. He had been educated at the Thylaurian Military Academy, where the history of human-Thylaurian relations occupied a substantial portion of the first-year curriculum. The Extinction War had its own course causes campaigns, the strategic necessity of final operations all laid out in thorough, well-sourced detail. There was no coexistence accords in any of it. No neutral zone, no treaty. The footage following the documents was harder to look at. It began with star charts. Overlays showing Thylaurian fleet positions 103 years ago plotted against human colony locations. The fleet positions moved coordinated converging, following the pattern of an operation planned in advance, not a response to an attack. A first strike executed along 17 vectors simultaneously against targets. The overlay identified one by one as civilian population centers, not military bases, not fleet positions, cities, habitats, colony platforms, agricultural installations, medical facilities. The death toll counter in the corner of the footage began at 0 and climbed. It climbed for a long time. It stopped at 13,420,211,000, and some remainder displayed as a precise 6-digit number because whoever compiled this footage had believed with a thoroughness that Dale found devastating that every single one of those lives deserved to be counted exactly. This is Operation Clean Slate, Voss said, and her voice had not changed, still level, still deliberate, carrying no anger that Dale could detect. The operation your government has never acknowledged. The operation your history books do not record. 13,420,000,000 people. Not soldiers. Families. Children who had never held a weapon. Killed in 72 hours while the Thalorian Assembly's diplomatic delegation publicly maintained that the peace remained intact. The sector was completely silent. Fabricated, Kreth said, one word. But the certainty that had characterized every prior statement was no longer the same certainty. It had a different quality, the flatness of a closed door rather than a clear path. You're welcome to identify the fabrication, Voss replied. We've been preserving those records for a century. They're complete. Every frame, every document, every name. Then she said something she had not said before, and she said it without emphasis as a plain statement of fact. We have had 103 years to think about this moment, Admiral. We did not approach it without preparation. Kreth's voice came back after a silence 4 seconds longer than his previous pauses. Commander Dale, return to the flagship immediately. Dale looked at Nira. She held his gaze without flinching, and in her expression he saw the question he was asking himself and no expectation that he would be able to answer it yet. Maintain station, he told her. Log everything. Keep sensors at full resolution on all contacts. He paused at the door. If anything changes, I'll reach you, she said. The shuttle ride to the Celestial Dominion took 11 minutes. Dale spent most of it looking at the new horizon from the outside, for the first time the dark hull catching no light, the geometry unlike anything he had trained to recognize as either threat or ally. It looked like something designed by people who had stopped caring how their ships appeared to others and had focused entirely on what their ships could do. He found Admiral Kreth alone in his private study off the main bridge. In 40 years of command, Kreth had developed a face that revealed very little. The Academy spoke of Kreth's face the way it spoke of certain tactical maneuvers technically accomplished, optimized through repetition, a tool rather than a window. Dale had seen that face in briefing recordings, in command archives, and twice in person, during formal inspections, and it had always been the same. It was not the same now. Still controlled, still professional. But something beneath the control had shifted. The way a door shifts when the latch releases, still the same door, still the same frame, but no longer held in the same position. Kreth held up a data crystal. Small thumb joint size, its casing marked with a color code Dale had never encountered in 22 years of service. Not because he had never seen classified materials, but because this color indicated a classification tier that officially he had never been informed existed. S7. Take this, Kreth said. Read it alone in a private room on this vessel, not on the station. He held Dale's gaze steadily. What's on it has been in the restricted military archives since before either of us was born. I received access when I reached flag rank. I was told it was to remain sealed. A pause. I am choosing to unseal it. Dale took the crystal. Why me? Kreth looked at him for a long moment. Because you have been stationed in Sector 12 Gamma for 22 years, and your instinct when this began was to observe before reporting. Because you asked the right question, why isn't it doing anything, and you kept asking it when everyone else had stopped. Because I need someone who learned history the same way the general population did. Someone who was not indoctrinated from birth in the upper echelons of this institution. He turned to the viewport. And because someone needs to know. Someone who might see another path forward. Dale left. He read the crystal in a borrowed officer's quarters seated at a small desk with the door locked. He read it in absolute silence. It took 40 minutes. The coexistence accords were real. Every document Voss had transmitted matched the originals in the archive, identical text, identical timestamps, identical signatures. The neutral zone designation for Sector 12 Gamma was real. The diplomatic correspondence from 2 centuries ago was real, pages of it covering the careful negotiation of terms between two expanding civilizations that had genuinely attempted to find a framework for coexistence. Operation Clean Slate was real. The planning documents were the hardest part. Not the casualty reports, those were numbers, and numbers carry a mercy in their abstraction. That specific detail does not. The planning documents were harder because they were ordinary. Staff meetings, resource allocation memos, logistics chains, the infrastructure of a decision made calmly, professionally, with full understanding of what it would produce by people who had attended the same academy Dale had attended, eaten the same food, believed in the same things. And then he reached the logistics approval chain. The list of signatures was long, 17 names across several pages, each attached to a specific operational sector, each representing an officer who had reviewed the resource requirements for their assigned portion of the operation and authorized the expenditure. The 14th name on the list was a name Dale knew. He had grown up knowing it. It sat on a memorial plaque in the Academy's Hall of Honor beneath a citation using words like distinguished and essential and in service to the Assembly's security. It appeared in the first chapter of 3 different history books in the context of military leadership during a time of necessary difficulty. He had said it out loud as a child with pride. It was his father's name. Dale placed his palm flat on the desk. He made himself breathe. He sat with it, not with the fact of the name in the document, which was specific and containable, but with everything the name implied about the distance between what he had been given and what was true. His father had kept a garden, had made a particular tea every morning that filled the kitchen with a smell Dale associated still with the concept of safety, had spoken about service with a reverence that Dale had internalized completely, carrying it into 22 years of his own service. His father had helped plan the deaths of 13 billion people, had signed the forms, had come home afterward and made the tea and kept the garden, and said nothing for the rest of his life because the history written after made silence not just possible but necessary. Because the history written after had made the garden and the tea and the Hall of Honor plaque achievable. Dale sat at the desk for a long time. Outside the viewport of the borrowed quarters, the sector was filling with ships that should not exist, crewed by people born in darkness because his father and people like his father had made the darkness necessary. And one woman on one of those ships had held a steady voice through all of it, had held it across 103 years of preparation and silence and waiting, and had arrived here and said, "We are not here because of war. We are here because of truth." He returned the crystal to Kreth. He said nothing. Kreth looked at his face and nodded once, and that was enough. A private channel opened from the New Horizon to Station Velian 7, and Nira relayed it to the Celestial Dominion. Voss's voice, "Commander Dell, I'd like to speak with you privately if that's acceptable." He took the channel in a side room off the bridge. The conversation that followed began not with politics or history, but with something much smaller. "How are you doing?" Voss asked. He was surprised enough to answer honestly. "I'm not certain I have a framework for how I'm doing." That's a reasonable response to today. And there was something in her voice that was for the first time genuinely warm. Not performed, not calculated. The warmth of recognition, one person acknowledging another's reality without reducing it. "I want to ask you something, and I want to be honest about why I'm asking." "Go ahead." "We've been watching this sector for 6 years before we chose to show ourselves. We have detailed intelligence on the Thylorian military structure in this region, assessments of every flag officer within range." A pause. "Admiral Kreth is a capable commander, and by all evidence, a man of genuine personal integrity. But the people he answers to are not interested in what we have to show them. The High Assembly has spent a century building historical justification for Operation Clean Slate. Dismantling that justification means dismantling the legitimacy of everything built on top of it. There are people in that structure who will not allow this conversation to succeed because success means accountability." "The danger isn't Kreth," Dale said. "The danger is never the person in front of you," Voss said. "It's the person who isn't in the room." A brief silence. Then, "I should tell you I'm having a parallel version of this conversation on my own side. My Deputy Commander Reeve lost his entire family in the first 48 hours of Operation Clean Slate. He has been a committed and capable officer for 30 years. He is also carrying something I cannot ask him to put down, and he believes that every hour spent attempting negotiation is an hour that gives the Assembly time to reinforce its positions." She paused. "He has been arguing for a preemptive strike. I have 48 hours before that argument becomes a formal command challenge. 103 years of surviving, building, waiting, and the fracture was not between the humans and the Thylorians. It was inside both of them simultaneously. The people who wanted to build something new, and the people who needed first to destroy something old." Before Voss could continue, the sector erupted. The weapons discharge was unmistakable on Doale's relay display. Thylorian configuration originating not from the Celestial Dominion or any vessel in Kreth's formation, but from a single destroyer that had in the past 3 minutes quietly repositioned itself 30 degrees off the main formation. The resolute Colonel Vorn's vessel, assigned as a secondary tactical asset, now occupying what Dael recognized instantly as a firing position. The discharge was a full-power directed energy salvo designed to cut through capital ship plating. It crossed the distance to the New Horizon in under a second. It did not reach the New Horizon. In 0.8 seconds, faster than Dael's display could resolve, as continuous motion, a containment field appeared around the incoming salvo from no visible source or emitter. The energy hung there for precisely long enough to make the point, and then it dissipated. Not reflected, not absorbed, simply ended. On the open channel, Dale heard Commander Reeves' voice for the first time. "There it is, Captain. Same as it's always been. First opportunity." "Stand down, Commander Reeve," Voss, exactly as she had been throughout. Not louder, not harder. Carrying nothing that sounded like anger. Though Dael understood now that a person capable of producing that quality of calm under these circumstances was not a person without emotion, was a person who had decided long ago and finally that emotion would not make decisions for him. A silence. The silence of a man on the other end of a command standing very still. "Stand down," she said again. "Quiet. Absolute. Colonel Vorn's action does not represent the Thylorian fleet. It represents Colonel Vorn, and it has been noted. Another silence. Then Reeves said in a voice carrying something that cost him to contain, "Yes, Captain." The channel returned to its prior state. On the Celestial Dominion, Kreth had already ordered Vorn's arrest. His voice relayed to Diel carried something that was not quite the tone Diel had heard from him before the data crystal. Not certainty, not its opposite. Voss's voice returns to the private channel. To answer your question from before, Commander, what I need from you is simple. A pause. Keep watching, keep thinking, keep asking the questions you've been asking since this morning. Then you're going to need that habit after today. The channel closed. Kreth's transmission came in moments later, his voice flat. I will not negotiate with a display of force. Voss accepted this without hesitation. I understand, Admiral. We've been waiting for 103 years. A few more hours won't change anything fundamental. She said it without irony, without edge, with the simple patience of someone who means it completely. The channel closed. Dael stood on the bridge of the Celestial Dominion and looked at Admiral Kreth. For the first time in 22 years of watching senior officers operate, he saw something in the old Admiral's eyes that did not belong to certainty, something small that had not been there at the start of this day. Doubt is a quiet thing. It doesn't announce itself. It arrives in the eyes the way a crack arrives in stone, not dramatically, but with the inevitability of pressure that has been building longer than anyone noticed. Dael looked at it. He thought about 13 billion names. About a woman's voice carrying 100 years of darkness and offering something it had every reason not to offer. He thought about his father's garden and his father's tea. Outside the viewport, 847 ships held their positions in the sector that remembered what it used to contain. And somewhere in the dark between them, something was moving that neither side had fully accounted for. Kreth made his decision at 0400 station time. Dael was not asleep. An aide delivered the message verbally, because Kreth had decided this particular communication should not exist in any written record. The Admiral was going to the New Horizon, alone, without weapons, without escort, without the formal protocols that govern contact between opposing officers, because those protocols required informing the High Assembly in advance, and informing the High Assembly in advance would produce orders he had decided he was no longer willing to follow. Dael was to hold the Celestial Dominion and the strike force in position using his own judgment as needed. And he was to take the data crystal not to read again, but to hold with the understanding that it constituted authorization to release its contents to every Thylorian colony world within transmission range if Kreth did not return within 8 hours. The aide relayed Kreth's final words verbatim. I have spent 40 years being certain of things that were not true. Certainty, in my experience, has a cost that compounds. Dael accepted the crystal and went to the bridge. The diplomatic shuttle was small and unarmed by design, its exterior markings identifying it as non-combat in every convention both species had agreed upon in the century before either of them had any conventions left. Kreth flew it himself. Dael watched the departure on the bridge display, the small vessel crossing the dark space between formations, growing smaller until it was indistinguishable from the starfield, then indistinguishable from nothing at all. No one on the bridge spoke. On the New Horizon, in a room that Dael had not yet seen, built into the ship's original plans before the fleet had ever moved, before the 6 years of watching and the century of preparation had taken their specific shape, Admiral Kreth of the Thylorian Assembly stood alone. The room was not large. It did not need to be. Its dimensions were approximately 15 meters in each direction, its walls made of a dark material that absorbed light the same way the ship's hull absorbed light. Every centimeter of every surface was covered in text so small that a person standing at the room's center could not read individual words, could only see from that distance that there was text, that the text covered everything, that the text was in its totality the entirety of what the walls contained. 13,420,211,000 names, no dates of death, no ranks, no designations of any kind. Only the names that parents had given to children, that those children had grown into and carried through lives, interrupted at various points across a 72-hour window 103 years ago, when the Thylorian Assembly's fleet had moved along 17 vectors toward targets, the planning documents called population centers, and that the names on the walls had called home. Voss had brought Kreth here without explanation and left without a word, closing the door behind her. No one accompanied him. No recording equipment monitored the room. Voss had been clear about that when she designed it. The room existed for a single purpose, And that purpose required privacy because what it asked of the people who entered it could not be done under observation. It asked them to stand with the full, unmanaged, uncontextualized weight of what had been done. Not the strategic assessment, not the historical framing, not the carefully maintained institutional language that had been built over a century to make the thing that had happened sound like a decision that reasonable people could have made rather than an atrocity that reasonable people had committed. Just the names, just the fact of them. Just the number of them, which was large enough that no human mind, no Thylorian mind, could actually hold it, as a number could only hold it as an abstraction, that the names on the walls were quietly, methodically converting back into what it actually was. People. Each name a person. Each person a world. Kreth stood in the center of the room and did not move for 42 minutes. He was not a man given to introspection. He had made his career on the clarity of external assessment, reading situations, evaluating options, making decisions based on available evidence. He had been, by every measure the Assembly's evaluation system provided, extraordinarily good at it. But the evaluation system had been built by the same institution that had constructed the history he had believed for 40 years. And standing in a room with 13 billion names on the walls, he understood something the evaluation system had no category for that. The most dangerous thing a person in authority can possess is not poor judgment. It is certainty that has not been tested against the full weight of what it costs. He had been certain. He had been certain for 40 years. And his certainty had sent young officers into battles fought for reasons this room documented were not the reasons he had been given. Had sent them, some of them, to their deaths in service of a history that had been constructed to make those deaths mean something they did not mean. He did not forgive himself in that room. He understood standing there that forgiveness was not the right framework, that the scope of what had happened exceeded what any individual act of contrition could address. He understood only that he was going to walk out and do the next necessary thing, and then the thing after that, and that whatever remained of his life was going to be spent in service of a truth rather than a system. Not because it would fix what had been done, because it was the only thing that remained to do that was worth doing. When he walked out, Voss was waiting in the corridor. She looked at him with the expression of someone who has shown this room to people before and knows what they look like when they come out of it. She did not say anything. He did not say anything. They walked to the diplomatic transport together. Dale was at the docking bay of the Celestial Dominion when the hatches opened. Kreth emerged first, same posture, same bearing, 40 years of command still sitting in the set of his shoulders. But something behind his eyes had been rearranged. Not broken, rearranged. The way a room looks after the furniture has been moved, each piece unchanged. The room fundamentally different. Behind him came Alara Voss. She was taller than Dale had constructed from her voice. His mind had built something more contained, and the reality was a woman of considerable height, with short dark hair going silver at the temples, wearing a uniform of deep green with silver insignia he did not recognize. She was in her mid-50s and wore her age the way people wear things they have chosen rather than things that have accumulated. Her face was not remarkable in its features, but remarkable in its expression, the expression of someone for whom steadiness had long since become the actual architecture of the face rather than something performed over it. Her eyes found Dale, assessment without hostility, the look of someone completing a picture that had previously existed only in data. "Commander Dale," she said in Thylorian. The accent was there as it had been on the channel, and like the silver at her temples, it seemed worn without apology, a reminder that she had learned this language from records made by people trying to destroy her species. "Captain Voss," he said. She nodded once. Then she turned to the corridor and the assembled senior officers of the Celestial Dominion's command staff who were watching her with expressions ranging from barely controlled fury to something Dale recognized as the early stages of the expression he had been carrying for the past several hours. The expression of a person whose understanding of the world is in the process of changing shape. The briefing room held 16 officers. Kreth stood at the head of the table. Voss stood to his left, slightly back, not deferential, but acknowledging that this was Kreth's moment to lead rather than hers. Her small diplomatic detail stood along the wall. Kreth placed the data crystal on the table and said, "Review this, all of you. Now, in this room, before I say anything further, I want your responses to be your own." Data pads were distributed. 16 officers read in silence. The silence changed quality over the next 18 minutes. It began as the professional silence of people receiving a briefing, attentive and analytical. It moved through something more uncertain, people encountering information that does not fit their available categories. Then it became something else entirely. Something Dale recognized because He had produced it himself alone at a small desk at the moment when a name on a document had made everything he had ever been certain of simultaneously true and unbearable. One officer, the Celestial Dominion's tactical commander, a woman who had served under Kreth for 19 years, looked up from her datapad and looked at Voss with an expression containing the entirety of what she was carrying. Not anger, not denial. Something raw and more disorienting than either. "This is real," she said. "Not a question." "Yes," Voss said. "How long have you had it?" "The documents we compiled over the past century as we gathered them. The originals have been in the Thalorian military archives since 203 years ago." The tactical commander looked at Kreth. "Sir, the High Assembly is aware of the originals," Kreth said. "They have been aware since the archive was established." He did not elaborate. He did not need to. Another silence longer. Then Voss spoke, and what she said was not what Dael expected, given the evidence just reviewed, the overwhelming force she commanded, and the 16 officers in front of her, absorbing a truth that restructured the foundations of their service. She said, "I want to be careful about what this moment does." The room looked at her. It would be easy for this to become a moment of judgment. For the evidence on those data pads to become the basis of a verdict delivered from a position of strength to people who cannot currently contest it. She looked around the table, meeting each face briefly without lingering. "That is not what we came here for. We came here because 103 years ago, people with authority made choices that the people living under that authority were never asked to consent to and never permitted to know about. The correct response to that kind of governance is not to replace it with a different version of the same thing." The room was very quiet. "What we came for," Voss said, "is a different future, not a perfect one, not one that erases what happened, because nothing erases what happened. One in which what happened is known. One in which the neutral zone is reestablished, the species your assembly displaced are given the opportunity to rebuild, and the people in those orbital platforms can finally put their feet on a surface that doesn't move." Something shifted in her voice minimally, a compression, a brief tightening that was present and then controlled, like a hand closing and opening again. "My people have not seen a planet in 3 generations. They have been patient. They deserve to stop being patient." No one spoke. Then the tactical commander said quietly, "What do you need from us?" Before the signing, a secondary channel opened from the New Horizons bridge. Commander Reeves' voice came through, carrying the sound of a man who has spent a long time holding something very heavy and has arrived at last at a decision about it. "Captain," Reeves said. "Commander," Voss replied. A silence of 6 seconds. Not a decision being made, a decision already made in the 4 hours of the shuttle's absence now being completed. "I want it on record that I oppose this, that I believe we are extending trust to people who have not earned it and may not be capable of earning it." A shorter silence. "And I want it on record that I will honor the agreement, whatever my opinion of it." Voss looked at the secondary channel. "Noted, Commander, both parts." The channel closed. Dael thought about 30 years of carrying 72 hours. About a man choosing to honor an agreement he fundamentally opposed because his commanding officer had asked him to. It did not resolve anything about Reeve. It was simply true, and the truth of it mattered in a way he could not fully articulate, the same way the truth of many things in this day mattered, without resolving cleanly into language. Kreth signed the preliminary agreement in the briefing room. Voss witnessed. Then Kreth looked at Dael, held his gaze for a moment, deliberate and clear, and said, "You'll sign as well, Commander. Your presence at the beginning of this makes you the appropriate second." Dael took the stylus and held it. He thought about what he was adding his name to. The document in front of him, in the chain of causation extending backward from it through 6 years of observation, through 89 years in the dark, through 103 years of survival against every effort to make survival impossible. He was adding his name to the far end of that chain. The end that turned towards something other than what the chain had been built in response to. He thought about another name, his father's name in the logistics approval chain of Operation Clean Slate, in the same archive that this agreement now referenced. His father, who had made the tea and kept the garden and said nothing for the rest of his life because the history written after had made silence not just possible but comfortable. "I will not keep that silence," he signed. The preliminary agreement established 3 things. First, withdrawal of Thalorian military forces from the neutral zone territories designated in the coexistence accords. The same territories, same boundaries, same legal standing, reactivated after 203 years. Second, a joint communications protocol between the Terran Reclamation Fleet and the Thalorian military command structure in the sector, bypassing the High Assembly until formal diplomatic recognition could be negotiated. Third, Voss's sole non-negotiable requirement: transmission of the full S7 archive contents to every Thylorian colony world within range, within 48 hours. Not territory, not reparations, not military concession. The truth, transmitted without interference. To every Thylorian citizen who lived under the governance whose foundations it documented. Kreth had agreed to it without hesitation. The transmission went out at 1100 station time. Voss had positioned the New Horizon to use its own communication systems, which were, as she noted without elaboration, somewhat more powerful than the standard Thylorian broadcast array. The signal carried this S7 archive, and the preliminary agreement and recorded statements from both Kreth and Voss speaking separately, speaking honestly, saying the things that people say when they have decided to stop managing information and start providing it, and it went out across 40 light-years of Thylorian space simultaneously. Dale watched the broadcast log from Velian 7, where he had returned while Kreth and Voss completed the agreement's formal details. Nira was beside him. The station felt different now. Not smaller, but differently proportioned, as if the events of the past 30 hours had recalibrated the relationship between the room they stood in and the space surrounding it. Outside the viewport, things were moving. Human vessels were beginning the slow process of repositioning, not aggressively, not tactically, but with the deliberate motion of an arrangement being redesigned. The orbital platforms were shifting their orientations, their long-axis profiles turning toward the inner sector, beginning a transit that would eventually bring 2.3 billion people to the edge of the restored neutral zone. On paper, reality would take longer. It would take a very long time. The transmission going out across 40 light-years would reach colony worlds educated in the same history Dale had been educated in, administered by governments whose authority rested on the same foundations the archive documented. Some would receive it with the same rearrangement he had felt at the small desk in the borrowed quarters. Others would resist. A few would receive it with something worse than resistance. Knowing a thing does not make the thing's consequences resolved. It makes them visible, which is the necessary first step and also the hardest one, because visibility without resolution is its own particular weight. The process of truth is not the same as the completion of truth. He was holding that thought when Nira said, "Commander." He looked at her. Her voice had the quality he had learned across 8 months to pay immediate attention to. She was looking at her sensor display, with the focused stillness of someone reading something and needing to read it several times before deciding to speak. "What is it?" She turned the display toward him. A single contact. Thylorian heavy warship configuration. Approximately 14,000 tons, drive signature, consistent with a Dominion-class dreadnought. It was not within the sector boundary or the extended range of the current formation. It was at the outer edge of the long-range sensor network, which explained why it had taken this long to appear in the data at all. No identification signal, no transmission on any known frequency. The track reconstruction Nira had run backward through the sensor logs showed the vessel had departed its last known position approximately 6 hours ago. Before the preliminary agreement, before the briefing room, before the memorial room and the 42 minutes of standing with the names. Before any of it, "It doesn't match any Hull and Kreth's formation manifest," Nira said, keeping her voice even. "Cross-referenced twice. Not assigned to any strike force or patrol group in this sector." A pause. "I've sent 3 hailing queries, no response." Dael looked at the track reconstruction. The departure vector was away from the engagement zone, not toward any known Thylorian installation, not toward any system in the neutral zone, not toward anything his charts identified as a destination. Simply away, into the dark, into the spaces between things where the monitoring network was sparse and the gaps were large enough to move through undetected. He reached for the communication array and opened the channel to the New Horizon. Voss answered in 4 seconds, still on her bridge. "Captain Voss," Dale said, "I need you to look at something." He transmitted the sensor data, the track reconstruction, the absence from the manifest, the silence in response to 3 hailing queries. The pause on her end was 5 seconds, and in those 5 seconds, he could hear faintly the background sounds of a working bridge voices. Instrumentation, the ambient evidence of people doing their jobs across the whole enormous distance of everything that had happened today. "We see it," she said. "Do you recognize the configuration?" "Yes, Dominion class, older refit based on the drive signature pre-war vintage." Another beat. "Commander, I'm going to be honest with you. We've been tracking this hull intermittently for the past 6 weeks. It's been appearing and disappearing at the edges of our sensor range. We couldn't establish a consistent track until now. 6 weeks, before the decision to reveal themselves. before the approach to Sector Center. Someone in that vessel had known or suspected or been positioned to observe and had chosen not to be seen and had now chosen to leave and had done both on a timeline that coincided with events too precisely to be coincidental. "Who is it?" Dale asked. "We don't know," Voss said. "That's what concerns me." He looked at Nira. She had already run the hull against every accessible record and was looking at the result with the expression of someone who has come to the end of available information and found nothing on the other side. Not Vorn's vessel was accounted for under human observation, its crew still aboard its command under arrest. Not any officer in Kreth's formal chain of command. Not any vessel assigned to this sector under any operational designation the records contained. A ship with no name. Moving in a direction the charts did not identify as a destination. Carrying intentions the available data did not illuminate. "We'll send trackers," Voss said. "Two vessels can reach its position within 40 minutes without disrupting the formation. Then, Commander, the agreement we signed this morning is a piece of paper. What makes it real is everything that happens around it. The people who sign agreements are not always the only people with the ability to affect what those agreements produce." She said it without accusation. As a fact, the way she said most things. "We've been watching this sector for 6 years," she continued. "We know the High Assembly will respond to this morning's transmission with resources that neither you nor Admiral Kreth can fully anticipate or control. The vessel on your display may be the beginning of that response, or it may be something else entirely. We don't know yet." A pause. "What we do now is the same thing you've been doing since this morning, Commander." He waited. "We watch," she said. "We think. We ask the right questions." Then with the same genuine warmth she had produced once before in the private channel, not performed, not calculated the warmth of one person, simply seeing another clearly. "That habit of yours is going to matter more in the next months than anything else we signed today." The channel closed. Dale looked at the point on his display that was the unidentified vessel moving through the dark between stars carrying whatever it carried into the spaces where sensors were thin and the silence was old. Then he looked out the viewport. The sector was transformed. Where there had been empty space for 103 years, there was movement. Human ships and Thylorian vessels navigating the same coordinates, their transit paths arranged by the Joint Communication Protocol with the careful precision of two systems learning in real time how to share a space that neither had fully shared before. The orbital platforms, those enormous patient structures that had been home to 3 generations of people who had never seen a planet, were moving slowly into the inner sector. Their motion barely perceptible against the starfield, but perceptible the way the long hand of a clock is perceptible if you look at it long enough. 2.3 billion people beginning to move toward the light. Nira was quiet beside him. When Dale glanced at her, she was looking at the same thing he was looking at: the movement in the sector, the ships and platforms, the improbable evidence of a history that had turned a different direction than everyone had been told it turned. After a while, she said, "Do you think it will hold?" He considered it seriously the way the question deserved. It was large enough that the answer required a moment to assemble itself. He thought about what it would take, what it had already taken across a century of people deciding every morning to continue building something they would not live to see completed. He thought about the woman on the ship at the sector's center who had held a steady voice across all of it and arrived here and offered something it had every reason not to offer. He thought about Kreth in the memorial room, standing for 42 minutes with 13 billion names coming out, changed in the only way that matters. Not absolved, not forgiven, but committed. Oriented differently. Pointed toward the thing that remains to do, rather than away from the thing that cannot be undone. He thought about Reeve carrying 30 years of loss, choosing to honor an agreement he disagreed with because his commanding officer had asked him to. He thought about his own father's name in a document in an archive, and about the document he had just signed, and about the distance between those two pieces of paper, and about what it meant that both of them carried a name from the same family. He thought about the unidentified vessel moving through the dark, and about everything that remained uncertain, and about how much of it was likely to stay uncertain for a long time. "I think it has a chance," he said. "I think that's the most honest answer I can give." Nira was quiet for a moment longer. "It's enough," she said finally. "For today, it's enough." Outside the viewport, Thylorian and human vessels moved through the same space for the first time in 103 years, their navigation lights distinguishable from each other by color and pattern, both of them distinguishable from the stars behind them, and the stars were exactly what they had always been. Ancient and enormous and entirely indifferent to the business of the species moving through the dark between them, which was, Dale thought, the right way for stars to be. The transmission continued outward at the speed of light, carrying its contents toward worlds that did not yet know they were about to receive it, toward people who would read it and be rearranged by it, who would carry the weight of it into futures that no one standing in this sector today could fully see the shape of. That was the nature of truth. It travels at its own pace, arrives when it arrives, and does what it does to the people it reaches, whether or not anyone is prepared for it. Sector 12 Gam was no longer Valanthe. No longer the hollow of a hand after the held thing has been set down. No longer the silence after music stops. Something had been restored to the hollow carefully by hands that had been keeping it safe for 103 years, waiting for the moment when setting it down gently was possible rather than simply necessary. The stars in Sector 12 Gamma did not move, but everything else had.